Hi, I'm Eli Hall. I'm Professor of Graphic Design at Colorado Mesa University. I'm here with Jake Watkins at Screen Image, and he's going to give us a tour of the screen printing process.
Let's get started. In screen printing, we mainly get files by email. Every once in a while, people will bring in discs, but it's pretty rare these days. We try to get everything in vector format. It's a lot easier for us to work with. Photoshop files are in raster format, and that's much harder to produce separations from. So if we can get PDFs, EPS, Illustrator files, any of those are really good for us because those are vector formats and they print separations really easy. In screen printing, color modes don't really matter, RGB versus CMYK, because when we output them, we're not outputting them via a screen's output output spectrum, because on a screen you're just dealing with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, or if you're dealing with a regular printer like this. In screen printing, we deal with spot colors. So each of these colors in this design, the blue, yellow, gray, and peach, all of those are separate plates, completely separate. If you're printing on a regular printer, that would output as just cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And on this file, if I hit print from this dialog, only the white, yellow, peach, gray, blue, and black are going to print, and each is going to be its own separate file. In screen printing, we tend to use Pantone colors because the Pantone system is a really good way to match colors across all kinds of different media. On your screen, on your inks, on your shirts, it's always going to be the same color if you're using the same Pantone number. And so each of these, like our blue is a Pantone 307, our gray is Pantone 431, peach is Pantone 467, and it just goes on like that. And it allows us a lot of consistency throughout the whole process. Sometimes we have a lot of trouble with clients who want a gradient that goes completely through a whole spectrum, and that's actually really difficult because since we have to separate them out into separate plates, that means that you're going to have 8 colors in a print instead of just creating a screen or a halftone screen from one color to the other and blending. This is our halftone screen. It just helps us know how we're going to print things. This is at 30 lines per inch. This is a 75% black, 50% black, 30, and 20. And you can see how as you get a lesser percentage at the same density, you're getting a much smaller dot. And if you go to a lower lines per inch, your dot blows up, but they're much less frequent. These are halftones in screen printing are how you achieve gradients or partial tones of a color, which is why it's called a halftone. Instead of printing a solid black, it'll print with space in between so that when you see it from a distance, your eye sees a different color value instead of a solid color. Okay, so this is the logo we received via email from CMU Press, and we got it in an EPS file and a PDF file. And when we tried to open the EPS, we actually found out that it was saved in a higher version than we have. So we had to go back to the PDF instead. And that's fine, but when a PDF saves, it saves everything as process colors. So I have to go in and I have to change this to a spot color. I'm going to double click on my color so that I can bring up the color options. I'll rename it to Printing Black. And I will change the color type to spot color. And now that color will be a spot color where I can just select that one color. Now I will make sure that everything in the file is that same black. Hopefully this will work. And okay, so now I will check it for size. Now you just select everything in your design, and then right up here in your width and height boxes, You can see how big your file is. This one is 7.5 inches by 7.5. Then I will set the page as close as I can get it to the dimensions of the artwork. And then you select everything, make sure everything's grouped so it doesn't move on you. So now I'll go to the align palette and I will make sure that everything is set to align to artboard, and then use your center functions so that your artwork is completely centered on your artboard. Now I'll go in to the print dialog. On my marks and bleed, that's one of your subset menus. That'll let you set all your printer marks. And for screen printing, we don't need trim marks and color bars because we don't really use that on shirts. If you're printing a package or something, you'll have to have those, but for shirts it's different. We use a Japanese print mark because it makes a much easier registration, and we try to make them a pretty heavy one so that you can always line up to it. On output, I come over here. This is just another one of your sub menus. I change, usually this is on composite, but I'm changing it to separations because we're doing screen printing instead of CMYK printing. So these are all the process colors, and they're all turned off because we only have spot colors in there. And so the printing black is the only color that we have in the entire document. So I will set the size to custom so that it'll only print to my artboard size. And I have film in the printer, and click print and we should be good. In screen printing, we use an acetate film, which is, it's basically a plastic transparency, but instead of just being plastic, it's got a layer of gelatin on there. And in screen printing, we don't have any color inks in our printers. It's all black. Every single ink cartridge is black. And it's a special formula that when it prints with this gelatin, it really sets up hard. And so it's a really, really dense black, so that when we go and expose a screen, everything that is black is going to not expose. Everything that is clear is going to expose. So that's going to create my stencil where these black areas will wash out and the clear areas will stay in. So now that we've gotten our file into the computer and we've gotten it printed onto our film, we can go ahead and expose it onto a screen and start printing. In screen printing, we use these kind of screens to print with. It differs from a printer printing because a printer will lay down a dot of ink. In screen printing, we have what basically equates to a window screen. So your holes are square instead of round. You're kind of playing a game of microns. When you're passing ink across this, it'll fill up that little cell, and when the screen pulls off the shirt, the surface tension of the ink will pull it down onto the shirt and out of the screen. When we start, we take a scoop coater, fill it with emulsion, then you bring it up against the screen and you'll lay down a really smooth layer on both sides so that when it dries, you have a completely filled screen that's photosensitive, so that when it's exposed to light, it will create a stencil. We actually use anywhere from a 60 mesh screen all the way up to a 305 mesh screen, and those numbers basically mean how many holes there are per square inch. And so this screen here is a 138, which means that in 1 square inch of this screen there are 138 holes. And the reason that's important is because on a 60 mesh screen your filament is huge, and on a 138 it's almost half that size. So when you're using a 60 mesh screen, when you fill that cell, your ink is going to be twice as thick as on a 138 mesh screen. But the downside to a low mesh screen like a 60 is that it won't print nearly as much detail. It's a much lower resolution. So it's a trade-off. You can either get good coverage and low detail, on a low mesh screen, or you can get high detail with less coverage on a higher mesh screen. So this is a design that we've already done. The job is finished and everything, but this is the area that we covered with emulsion. And as you can see, when we exposed it, everything that was black on our film would have washed out, and the white you see there is ink that we've gotten printed through the screen. So all these areas that were covered with emulsion did not print on the shirt. All these areas that are white washed out and did. On a 60 mesh frame, you can also use like thicker inks or specialty inks. Like puff inks are really hard to pull through a high mesh screen because the holes are so small and the ink particles are so large. So it's much easier to use those kinds of low mesh screens with those specialty inks. So like with water-based inks, we would they run like water. So you would use a 305 so that you're not going to get a lot of run through and bleed out, because you're using a much smaller cell size. Once you put emulsion on a screen, it usually takes about maybe a half an hour to dry in still air. If you put a fan on it, it'll dry faster. But once it's dry, it's ready to be exposed. So we'll go get a screen with emulsion in it and we'll expose our design. So those registration marks that we put on in Illustrator, we're going to use those now. These center marks are really important, which is why we centered the artwork to the artboard. These marks are now in the exact center of the artwork, and so I'll just take this, set some tape on it so that I can attach it to my screen. And I will use the registration marks for the size of screen I have, and it's got a center line down the middle so that every time I put my center marks on my artwork on the center line of the registration, as long as I line my screen up in the right place, it's also going to be in the center of my screen. So now I have the artwork attached to my screen. It's set up so that when I print out in the shop, my design will print as a positive on my t-shirt. So I'll bring that over to my exposure unit. So now that we have our artwork on our screen, we can take it into the exposure unit. And this is a vacuum light table. So I will clamp this down and shut off the air so that when I turn it on, not only will the light expose from the bottom, but it'll also suck this membrane down on top so that everything is perfectly flat. And perfectly flat is really important in screen printing, because if you get a bow in your film or your screen, you get a distortion of your artwork and things won't be in registration. The color of the emulsion makes a difference in how long it'll expose. A blue emulsion will usually expose for 2 minutes, a red emulsion will expose for 4. The color of your mesh also makes a difference, because white scatters more light, so it scatters more energy. And so a white screen will expose faster than a yellow, because yellow mesh absorbs more of the energy and doesn't give it to the emulsion. Now that our screen has had some time to expose, I'll release the air pressure, pop it open, and we should have a finished screen. So I'll take off the film and we'll come on over and wash it out. So the emulsion we use is water-based, so the only exposure chemical that we actually need to make the screen wash out is just water. So all you got to do is basically wet your screen down on both sides. And as you start to do that, your design starts to show up. Because everything that was clear on our film is now exposed. So everything that was clear on our film is now exposed, which means that it is not reactive to water. But everything that was black on our film did not expose, and that leaves it reactive to water. So As soon as I hit that with water, those two exposures of emulsion reacted, and I have my design starting to show up. The more water I put on this, the more that unexposed emulsion will start to come out. Okay, so I'll start washing this out. As you're washing out, you want to make sure that you don't spray too long in one place, because you can actually poke a hole in this emulsion, and that means that you're going to have extra ink on your screen that you didn't want. But you also need to make sure that as you're going through, you are getting every little piece of detail out of the screen that you possibly can. So it's kind of a balancing game, making sure that you spray hard enough, but not so hard that you break a hole in your screen. And since it's got water all up in it right now, I have to make sure that I get that out of there, because if the water dries in the screen, all the particulate that's in the water will form a bridge across my screen printing cells, and I won't be able to pass ink through those. So I take it over here and blast it with compressed air just to make sure that I can get that as dry as I can. Now that we got the screen dry and everything, it's ready to go out into the shop. We'll get it completely dried, taped up, and we will get it set up for printing. So this is our 8-color automatic press. We basically use this for any high volume jobs, because this can it prints all of the colors at once instead of having to do each one separately. So you cut down on your production time by quite a bit. It'll probably do around 400 shirts an hour if you really get it cranking, and it basically just fills the screen on the flood pass and then runs the squeegee over and transfers the ink to the shirt. And then after the first color prints, it'll go under a spot dryer so that that ink will set up and not be reactive when the next color prints over top of it. As this design prints, the machine will bring a flood of ink across it, and that will fill all the cells of the screen. And then on the return pass, the squeegee will pass over it and empty all those cells onto the shirt. So now that ink has transferred from the screen onto the shirt, and it passes under the spot dryer. And the spot dryer allows us to set this ink so that it won't react with the next color that prints. Sometimes you don't want to use a spot dryer because you want your inks to blend, but for this particular job we need the first ink to be completely separate, so we're spot drying. We use plastisol inks here. That basically is short for plastics insolvent, and what that means is that all of these colors are basically just itty bitty teeny tiny microscopic beads of that color plastic, and they're suspended in solvent, thus plastisol. And each of these inks, when we print them, when you pass them through the dryer, all the solvent evaporates away and the plastic beads melt together to form one sheet. And so as they melt together, they also melt down around your filaments in your shirt. So not only do they form one sheet, but they sink down into the structure of your fabric, and that'll make them really long lasting, and they'll pretty much outlast the shirt because the plastic is more durable. All of these are different colors that we've used for different jobs throughout our history. We basically tend to custom match inks for certain jobs, and we keep them around because people will reorder sometimes, or other people will want to use the same things. We try and match them as close as we can to the Pantone numbers, but that's not always possible. So we kind of just get them as close as we possibly can. And if someone picks a Pantone number, then we try to pick the closest ink that we have to it, if that's okay. If we don't have the color, then we'll actually have to hand mix it. And you'll usually start with a base of like Pantone, pure yellow, pure red, any of the pure colors, and then you will add pure, what they call a PC color, which it stands for pure color, and it's almost completely just that color bead. So there are recipes within the Pantone system that tell us this is how much pure red you add to pure yellow to get burnt orange, or whatever Pantone number you need. And so we try and get as close as we can with that, and then if the customer still isn't satisfied, we'll just hand tint it with them here until they're satisfied with the color.
Can you order Pantone inks pre-made?
You can order Pantone inks pre-made, but they're usually more expensive because the companies that mix those are very, very, very precise. And they spend a lot of time getting their batches right and making sure that everything's absolutely perfect and consistent across all of their batches. It's usually easier just to start with your own, especially with the small volume that we usually run. You don't need a whole gallon of an off-color maroon. You just need maroon. So for the most part, we hand mix our custom colors.
What's the benefit to plastisol ink in this part of the country?
For screen printing, plastisol is the best because it attaches to your fabric much better. Water-based ink you can only really use on a white shirt because it will soak into the fabric instead of sitting on top of it. So you lose a lot of luster. Water-based inks are excellent though for paper printing because you get a lot of shine through the paper. All the different inks just have different applications. Screen printing is not just for fabric, it's used in many processes. But even within the plastisol family, you have all kinds of different specialty inks, like a photochromatic ink, which is clear when it's not exposed to UV light, but as soon as it's exposed, it starts to blast its color out. So you can make invisible print shirts where it looks like just a white shirt, but you walk outside in the sunlight and all of a sudden the design shows up. Or you can have puff inks that when they pass through the dryer, they'll stand up off of the shirt really thick, and you can create patterns and texture using those kinds of inks. So there's even a lot of variation within the plastisol family. Since the plastisol inks are oil-based instead of water-based, they don't evaporate very quickly. The oil will stay and keep these suspended for quite a long time. Water-based ink, you have to make sure that it's completely sealed all the time because the water will evaporate out into the atmosphere extremely quickly and you'll have an ink that you can't use anymore. Plastisols, they'll usually stay suspended for upwards of 2 or 3 years. So basically I'm just using this tape to close up any holes that I may have created in my washout process or any holes that are inherent in the screen. And so now this is ready to be lined up. I'll take it and I'll put it into the press. Now that I have my screen kind of a little bit locked down, I need to make sure that I can get my design lined up to the center of my printing table. So I'll use a T-square. I have a 14-inch table, so I'll just be trying to set those center registration marks again on the 7-inch mark. Just double check that you got everything right where you want it. And while this looks easy on a one color, it can be very complicated trying to line up more than one color because not only do you have to get it centered on the table every time, but they have to be centered on each other as well. So most of the time when setting up a multicolor job, we will set up either white or black because they're the easiest to line up to, and then that one will be lined up to the table, and then you'll line everything else up to that color. So now that we've gotten our design lined up, I went ahead and got a squeegee. You want to make sure your squeegee is long enough that it's going to cover your entire design. So that'll make sure that I get ink cleanly across the entire thing. And in squeegees, you have harder squeegees, softer squeegees, and it makes a difference. The harder your squeegee, the more detail it's going to pull, and the sharper the edge, the more detail it's going to pull. The rounder the edge, the more ink it's going to lay down, and the softer, the more ink it'll push down into the cells. So I'm just grabbing a little bit of ink because we're just doing a few shirts. I'll go ahead and set that in below my design. And try to make sure that your roll is as even as you can, because that'll make sure that you're getting an even pass of ink across your design. Okay, so now that I have a shirt, I will go ahead and split it, open it up at the bottom, and you go ahead and set it on your table so that, just like if you were putting it on. And you'll bring it down and then pull it back, because that way you always get a nice even pull on your shirt. And you will bring it down, and you want to set your finger right at the top of your artwork and then kind of measure where it's going to fall on your shirt. So that's going to fall to the middle of my middle finger. We want a little more distance than that, so I'll pull the shirt up a little bit further. Measure again. And that's right at the bottom of my middle finger, so that's right about where we want it. And so I want to make sure that I always come to the same distance on this table. That'll make sure that all my design always falls at the same place on every single shirt that I print. And you also want to check side to side to make sure that the distance from the edge of your table to the seam of your shirt is also
Sorry, can you do that part again?
Yeah. And you also want to make sure that the distance from the edge of the table to the seam of the shoulder is going to be in the same place, so that since your design is centered on your table, it's also going to be centered on your shirt. So since we don't have any ink in the actual screen yet, it's just sitting on top, you want to raise your screen up off of your shirt a little bit, so that when you pull the ink into it, it's not going to go straight onto the shirt. You want to make sure that you grab enough ink to cover the entire design and flood all your cells. And now you can go ahead and let that fall down on the shirt. You want to hold onto the table so it doesn't move with your hip. And you grab your squeegee, set your thumbs, and then set your fingers directly opposite that so that you can always keep that angle right there. And then you press just hard enough to contact the screen with the shirt and pull all the way across as steady as you can. And then pull up and your design transfers. And I'll give that a couple more passes, because since this screen is so fine, it's not giving a really good coverage. But because this thing registers in the same place every time, I can grab a little more ink, flood, pass. Now that your design's set on your shirt, it's still wet, so you want to be as careful as you can. You want to grab the shoulder seams and pull straight up so that you don't flip up into the design doesn't flip up into itself. Then you take it over to the dryer, fold it, and set it so that the design will be exposed to the heat. So as these shirts pass through the dryer, they're passing through two stages. The first stage is an infrared heater at about 600 degrees. The second part is a gas heater at about 400 degrees. And the reason we have to get it so hot, you have to get the ink up to a melting point of about 320 degrees while it passes through there. And the reason that is, the spot dryer will set it up to where it won't react with another ink, but it won't actually bond it to the shirt. As it passes through here, we heat the ink up to the point where it actually starts to melt into that sheet and melt down into the fabric, so that it'll hold on to the shirt and it'll hold up for the lifetime of the shirt. If we didn't do this, it would hold up for maybe 4 or 5 washes, and then it would start to fall off. But as long as we heat it up far enough, it'll stay with the shirt forever. At the end of the process, once you're done running a full run of shirts, then you can actually reclaim each of these screens. That's the cool thing about screen printing, is that all of your plates are reusable. And the way we do that is we'll take one of these screens and we put a product called Renews It on it. And what that does is it takes this emulsion that's set in the screen right now and breaks it down into a water-soluble form. And so you soak it on both sides with a brush and let it sit for a few minutes, and all this will start to spray out. We use a power washer at about, it's probably around 80 psi, and we'll spray this, and all that emulsion will pretty much fall out. You'll actually have a little bit of an after image of your ink left in the screen, and we use another product called the pink stuff, simple enough, to take that out. It's called a mesh degreaser and abrader. It's got a little bit of pumice in it, so that as you pass it over the screen and scrub it in to get the ink out, the little pumice particles will actually fray the screen a little bit. And that's really important, because if you have a completely smooth filament, the emulsion won't attach. So as you abrade that screen a little bit, every time the emulsion will actually stick to your screen a little bit better. And at the end of that, the screen will dry, the water will come out of it, and you can start all over with new emulsion. So that's pretty much it for screen printing. I've had a lot of fun with screen printing over the past 10 years, and I really hope you guys have learned enough to get into it, and I hope you guys have fun with it too.